Maria Garcia, a 35-year-old Filipina, had spent the last few years of her life in Slovenia, along with her Slovenian husband, Luka, and their 2 young children. Originally from a small town in the Philippines, Maria had left her homeland in search of a better future. Luka had promised her a life filled with opportunity, stability, and the promise of a loving family. The decision to move to Slovenia was one that Maria hoped would bring prosperity and peace to their lives. When they first arrived in Slovenia, things seemed to be falling into place. Luka, a hard-working man employed in construction, provided for their family, and Maria took pride in managing the household and caring for their children. Together, they decorated their modest home, and while it wasn't extravagant, it was filled with love. As Christmas approached, their home was adorned with colorful lights, and the children eagerly awaited the festive season. Maria had big plans for this Christmas, her first in Slovenia. She wanted to create memories for her children and bring joy to their lives in a way she hadn't experienced growing up in the Philippines. The holiday season brought a sense of excitement. Luka, who had always been a doting father, was even more involved in the preparations this year. He put up the Christmas tree, hung the lights around the house, and spent time with the children, reminding them that Christmas was a time for family and love. Maria, feeling a warmth in her heart, couldn't help but feel hopeful. Despite the challenges of living in a foreign country, she had managed to create a home filled with laughter and togetherness. She even prepared a traditional Filipino feast, determined to introduce her children to the culture she had left behind. But as the days went by, there was an undercurrent of tension that Maria couldn't ignore. While Luka appeared to be the perfect husband and father, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. She had noticed subtle changes in his behavior. His mood swings were becoming more frequent, and there were moments when he would grow distant or overly controlling. Maria brushed these feelings aside, thinking that the stress of life in a foreign country might be getting to him. Perhaps it was just the pressure of adjusting to a new environment. On Christmas Eve, the Garcia family sat down for dinner together, laughing and sharing stories. The children, excited for the morning, couldn't contain their joy. Maria smiled, relieved that everything seemed perfect. But as the night wore on, Luka's demeanor shifted. His usual charm gave way to a dark cloud. He began drinking more heavily than usual, and the jovial atmosphere turned cold. Maria tried to maintain the cheer, but deep inside she felt a sense of dread creeping over her. The night ended uneventfully, or so she thought. The following day, Christmas morning, arrived. The children opened their presents with wide eyes, thrilled with the gifts they received. Luka seemed to be in better spirits, but Maria noticed the small, unsettling glances he would sometimes give her, glances that felt possessive and controlling. Still, she tried to enjoy the day. They exchanged gifts, laughed, and took pictures as a family. But something was off. Maria couldn't ignore the tension between them, a tension that seemed to grow stronger with every passing hour. As the day ended, Maria felt a heavy weight in her chest. She went to bed that night with a lingering unease, wondering what had happened to the man she had once loved. Little did she know that this seemingly peaceful Christmas would mark the beginning of a nightmare that would forever change her life. The phone rang the next morning, but it wasn't a friendly greeting. It was the police, reporting a shocking discovery. Luka had been found dead in their living room. His body lay on the floor, lifeless, and blood pooled around him. Maria was nowhere to be found, and what had been a dream of a better life was now a tragedy unfolding before everyone's eyes. Detective Anton Novak was immediately assigned to investigate the shocking death of Luka Garcia. The call had come in early in the morning, a report of a man found dead in his home, with no signs of forced entry, but clear signs of violence. His body was discovered in the living room, sprawled on the floor in a pool of blood. The scene was strangely calm, almost eerie, as if the crime had been planned, not a spur-of-the-moment act. The first thing Detective Novak noticed was the absence of Maria Garcia, Luka's wife. Her absence added to the mystery. What had happened, and where was she? Novak arrived at the crime scene, his mind racing through a series of possibilities. Could this be a robbery gone wrong? No, nothing had been stolen. Could Luka have been involved in something dangerous that led to his death? The lack of signs of struggle suggested it wasn't an external attack but something that had unfolded inside the family home. The detective's first instinct was to focus on the family, on Maria. She was the most obvious person of interest. She was missing, and there was no immediate explanation for her whereabouts. The investigation began with interviews of the neighbors and anyone who might have seen or heard anything unusual. The neighbors described the Garcia family as quiet and private. No one had heard shouting or anything that would indicate a violent altercation. There were no reports of tension or any disturbances leading up to Luka's death. The Garcia family had been seen together in the days leading up to Christmas, appearing happy and content. But appearances can be deceiving, and Detective Novak knew that. It didn't take long for the investigators to uncover some unsettling details about Luka's past. They found that Luka had been a kind and loving father, but his relationship with Maria had been far from perfect. In the months leading up to his death, there had been reports from friends and distant family members that Luka had become increasingly controlling and paranoid. He had started to monitor Maria's every move, and she was often seen walking on eggshells around him. Although no one knew the full extent of their private struggles, it was clear that their marriage had taken a darker turn. One of the first significant pieces of evidence came when the police reviewed the home's security system. It was a system that had been installed by Maria herself, as she wanted to keep an eye on the children while Luka was at work. But now, the cameras would reveal more than she had intended. The footage from the camera showed a disturbing pattern. Luka had been physically confrontational with Maria just days before his death. The footage captured him yelling at her, and at one point, pushing her against a wall. Maria had been visibly distressed, trying to calm him down, but it was clear that the relationship was deteriorating. In the days following Luka's death, there were further revelations. A few of Maria's friends and relatives in the Philippines came forward with troubling information. They mentioned that Maria had confided in them about her fear of Luka. She had been increasingly worried about his violent tendencies, and according to one source, Maria had been planning to leave him. But Luka's controlling nature had made it difficult for her to escape. She had felt trapped. These details, combined with the bruises and scars visible in the security footage, painted a grim picture of a woman trapped in a dangerous and abusive relationship. Despite all the evidence suggesting Maria's potential involvement, there was still no sign of her. She had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only unanswered questions. Detective Novak felt the weight of the case pressing on him. Where had Maria gone? Was she guilty of her husband's murder, or was she simply a victim caught in an unbearable situation? As the investigation continued, the detective knew that the answers lay somewhere within the twisted, complicated history of the Garcia family, and he was determined to find the truth, no matter where it led. The case was far from over, and the deeper he dug, the more complex and chilling it became. As the investigation into Luka Garcia's death deepened, Detective Anton Novak was faced with more questions than answers. The evidence surrounding Luka's death was disturbing, yet it didn't provide a clear picture of who was responsible. Maria, the prime suspect, had vanished without a trace. Her sudden disappearance only added layers of complexity to the case. Despite the mounting evidence against her, especially the footage showing Luka's aggressive behavior towards her, Detective Novak felt a nagging sense of uncertainty. There had to be more to this story than met the eye. Novak dug deeper into Maria's life, hoping to uncover some clue that could explain her actions. He found that, although Maria had built a new life for herself in Slovenia, she had kept in regular contact with her family back in the Philippines. Her relatives described her as a loving mother, deeply devoted to her children. But they also mentioned something troubling. Maria had been struggling for months, constantly seeking advice on how to handle her difficult marriage. The abusive behavior from Luka had escalated gradually, and by the time Christmas came around, Maria was at her breaking point. She was terrified, feeling cornered and helpless. Maria's best friend Isabel, who lived in the Philippines, provided a critical piece of information. Isabel recalled a conversation they had months earlier. where Maria had confessed that Luca had threatened her life on multiple occasions. These threats weren't just verbal. There were times when Luca had pushed her, grabbed her by the arm, and forced her to stay inside the house. Maria had considered leaving him several times but felt trapped. Her children were her only reason for staying, and yet the fear of Luca's violent tendencies kept her from escaping. Isabel, though concerned, hadn't fully understood the extent of the danger until she received a message from Maria shortly after Luca's death. The message, sent just days after the crime, was chilling. Maria wrote that she was in hiding, terrified for her life. She claimed that Luca had been violent with her again the night before his death, and this time she was certain he would have killed her if she hadn't defended herself. Maria explained that she had fled to a nearby cabin, far from the town where they had lived, and that she was too afraid to go back to the authorities. She asked Isabel not to tell anyone where she was hiding, and she begged for help, not just for herself but for her children as well. It seemed that Maria had reached her breaking point, and now she was on the run. Meanwhile, Detective Novak was piecing together Luca's past. The more he investigated, the more he discovered about Luca's secret life. Luca had been involved in shady dealings with a local criminal group, something his wife had been unaware of when they first met. As his business dealings grew, so did his temper and paranoia. He became obsessed with keeping his criminal life hidden from Maria, but in doing so, he started to isolate her. The detective uncovered financial records that showed Luca had been making large, unexplained payments to individuals connected to illegal activities. This new information added another layer to the case. Could Luca's death have been the result of a violent confrontation linked to his criminal associates? The twist in the investigation deepened when it was revealed that Luca had been blackmailing Maria. He had found out about her plans to leave him, and had threatened to take the children away if she ever tried to leave. The discovery of a hidden camera in their home painted a clearer picture of Maria's state of mind. The footage revealed moments of extreme tension between the couple, but it also showed something else. Maria had installed the cameras to protect herself. She had anticipated Luca's violent outbursts, but she never imagined they would escalate to this point. Despite all the evidence suggesting that Maria was a victim of both domestic abuse and Luca's criminal ties, the detective still couldn't fully understand her role in his death. Was she simply defending herself in a moment of extreme fear, or was there something more to the story? Was Maria guilty of a crime of passion, or was she a woman who had been driven to desperation by a dangerous, controlling husband? The detective had to keep digging, knowing that the answers to these questions could lead him down a very different path. As Maria remained in hiding, Detective Novak felt a mounting sense of urgency. He needed to find her not only for the sake of justice but also to understand the truth about what had happened that fateful night. The more Novak learned, the more he realized that the case was far more complicated than a simple domestic dispute. There were layers of deception, manipulation, and fear that had driven Maria to a breaking point. But what had truly happened the night Luca died remained a mystery. And as Novak grew closer to uncovering the truth, he began to question just how far Maria had been pushed before she finally decided to fight back. Detective Anton Novak's investigation had taken a significant turn, but the more he uncovered, the more questions emerged. The mounting evidence of Luca Garcia's violent behavior, coupled with his criminal connections, painted a grim picture of a man whose actions had spiraled out of control. But it wasn't just Luca's dark side that intrigued the detective, it was Maria, the woman at the center of it all. Was she a victim of a toxic marriage, a terrified woman fighting for survival, or was there more to the story that had yet to be revealed? The breakthrough came when Novak reviewed a series of phone records that had been recovered from the family's home. Among the documents was a series of increasingly desperate messages Maria had sent to her family in the Philippines. In these messages, she recounted the threats Luca had made against her life. She described how Luca had become increasingly violent and irrational, especially in the months leading up to his death. He had threatened her in front of their children, warning her that if she ever left him, he would destroy her and take the children away. Maria had confided in her family that Luca's controlling nature had become unbearable. Yet despite her pleas for help, No one had been able to reach her in time. Isabel, Maria's best friend from the Philippines, played a crucial role in connecting the dots. She shared another troubling piece of information. Maria had recently made arrangements to leave Luca. The plan had been to escape to another country, where she could start fresh with her children, free from the fear that had plagued her for years. But Luca had found out. He had discovered her secret plans, and the confrontation that followed had escalated into violence. Maria had no choice but to put her plan into motion faster than anticipated, and it was then that she vanished. Isabel's account made it clear that Maria had been pushed to the edge, with nowhere to turn. What disturbed Novak even more was the revelation of Luca's involvement in criminal activities. The investigation revealed that Luca had been entangled with a dangerous group involved in human trafficking and smuggling operations. He had used his position in construction to cover up his illegal dealings, and as his involvement grew, so did his paranoia. The more he became entangled in criminal activities, the more controlling he became over Maria. He feared that she might expose him, and in his twisted mind, he believed that keeping her under his thumb was the only way to protect himself. But despite all these revelations, Novak struggled to reconcile the facts with the reality of Maria's actions. The security footage from the home painted a disturbing picture of a woman trapped in a dangerous situation. It showed Luca's physical confrontations with her, his volatile temper, and his use of threats to manipulate her. Yet at the same time, there were moments in the footage where Maria seemed to retreat further into herself, as if resigned to the abuse. It was as though she had lost the ability to fight back, believing that there was no escape. The detective dug deeper into Luca's criminal ties, hoping to uncover more about what might have happened the night of his death. He learned that Luca's involvement in the criminal world had made him enemies, and there was a possibility that his death was tied to those dangerous connections. Perhaps Maria had been unaware of the full extent of Luca's dealings, and had only been drawn into the chaos when things spiraled out of control. But could this be the answer to why he had died? Was his murder a result of his own criminal activities, or was there a darker motive at play? The more Novak uncovered, the more he felt the weight of the complexity of the case. He knew that Maria had likely been a victim in many ways, trapped in a relationship with a man who controlled her through fear and manipulation. But did her fear push her to murder? Or was it a moment of self-defense? Did she kill Luca in a fit of rage, or was it the result of years of abuse that had driven her to her breaking point? The investigation into Luca's death took a new direction when Novak received an anonymous tip. The tipster claimed to know about an encounter between Luca and another man, a man connected to his criminal past. The tip led Novak to a possible theory. What if Luca's death had not been directly caused by Maria, but rather by one of his criminal associates? Maria, having been terrified of Luca for so long, may have only acted in self-defense after an altercation that went too far. But if someone else had been involved, what did that mean for Maria's innocence? As Novak continued to pursue this new lead, the mystery of what happened that night remained unsolved. But one thing was clear: the case was far more complicated than anyone had initially realized. Each revelation added more layers to the story, and it became evident that Luca Garcia's life was not just marked by domestic violence, but also by a web of deceit, crime, and manipulation. As the pieces slowly started to fall into place, Novak knew that the truth would be more elusive than he had ever imagined. As the investigation continued to unfold, Detective Anton Novak was confronted with the complexity of the case, each new discovery leading to more questions. The evidence, although compelling, was not enough to paint a clear picture of the events surrounding Luca Garcia's death. With Maria still in hiding, Novak knew that time was running out. He had to make sense of the puzzle that was quickly becoming more intricate than he had anticipated. One breakthrough came when forensic experts analyzed the crime scene. They discovered something crucial: a small amount of residue from a substance found on Luca's clothing, which seemed to suggest he had been involved in a struggle. The substance was linked to a chemical used in construction materials, the kind of chemicals Luca would have likely been exposed to in his line of work. This led Novak to a disturbing realization. There was more to Luca's death than a domestic dispute. or a random act of violence. It seemed that his murder was deeply tied to his criminal dealings. Could someone in his criminal network have gotten involved in the murder? The more Novak delved into Luka's past, the more he uncovered troubling connections to dangerous individuals. As Novak followed the leads, he received an anonymous tip that hinted at a new angle. The tipster mentioned a specific location, a cabin in the woods near the outskirts of town. It was the same cabin Maria had been rumored to have fled to after Luka's death. Novak decided to take a chance. He couldn't risk letting Maria slip through his fingers. The detective assembled a small team and went to the cabin, hoping it would hold the key to understanding what really happened. The cabin, located in a remote part of Slovenia, was isolated and quiet, with no sign of recent activity. Novak's team meticulously combed through the area, searching for any trace of Maria or evidence that could explain the murder. After hours of searching, they finally found a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside, they discovered a collection of documents, photographs, and a journal that seemed to have been kept by Maria. The journal revealed the heartbreaking truth. Maria had been keeping detailed records of her life with Luka, chronicling the abuse she had endured for years. She described in agonizing detail the physical and emotional toll of living with a man who had become a stranger, violent, controlling, and manipulative. There were entries about her desperate attempts to flee, but always with the fear of what Luka might do if she left. It was clear that Maria had been living in constant fear, unable to escape her husband's grasp. The journal also contained notes about her plans to leave, her attempts to reach out for help, and the escalating threats Luka had made against her. One entry stood out. Maria had written that the night Luka died, she had finally reached her breaking point. She had confronted him in the living room, demanding that he stop his abusive behavior. Luka had been drunk, angry, and violent. He had lunged at her, grabbing her by the throat, threatening to kill her. In a desperate act of self-defense, Maria had grabbed a heavy object from the table and struck Luka with it. The blow had knocked him to the ground, but it hadn't been enough to stop him. In a final act of rage, Luka had tried to strangle her, but in the ensuing struggle, he had fallen and hit his head against the edge of a table, causing a fatal injury. Maria had panicked, not knowing what to do. Fearing for her life and the safety of her children, she had fled the scene, leaving behind the chaos and terror of that night. Maria's journal painted a vivid picture of a woman who had been driven to the edge, pushed by years of abuse and manipulation. Novak realized that Maria's actions had been a desperate attempt to survive, not a calculated act of murder. In the heat of the moment, she had fought back against a man who had threatened to end her life. With this new information, Novak sought to piece together the final part of the puzzle. It became clear that Luka's death had not been solely the result of Maria's actions. His involvement in criminal activities had put him in danger, and it was possible that his criminal associates had played a role in the violence that night. There were indications that Luka's enemies had been watching him for some time, waiting for the right moment to strike. In the end, it seemed that Luka's death was the result of a combination of factors: his own violent behavior, his criminal connections, and his manipulation of Maria. As the case began to close, Detective Novak reflected on the complexity of what had transpired. Maria had been a victim, trapped in a nightmare of her own making, but she had acted out of sheer desperation to protect herself and her children. She had not intended to kill Luka, but in that moment of fear and survival, she had done what she needed to do to escape his grasp. The truth was more tragic than anyone had imagined: a woman pushed to the brink of madness, living in constant terror, and ultimately forced to fight for her life. In the end, the authorities decided not to press charges against Maria, considering the overwhelming evidence of her self-defense. She had been a woman desperate to escape a life of abuse, and while the consequences were tragic, it was clear that she had acted out of a need to survive. Maria was allowed to start over, though her past would always remain a haunting reminder of the darkness she had endured. And for Detective Novak, the case would remain etched in his memory, a stark reminder of the hidden horrors that can lie beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives.